So, good morning everyone, and welcome to this Interact on IFAD 2.0. A big welcome to our colleagues from the field. We have this morning with us Egypt, Indonesia, and also Kenya. And also big welcome to our panelists, Paul, Rossana, Lisandro, Turaya, and Katie. So we are here today to hear more about IFAD 2.0 and finally discover what's behind this mysterious name and numbers. So we have heard that IFAD 2.0 is about setting strategic directions for IFAD future. That it's about building on the ongoing reform to strengthen our contribution to SDG 2, Zero Hunger. But what does this mean, and why it is important for us? This is what we will hear this morning from our panel, but we also want to hear from you, your ideas, your reactions, your feedback to help shaping this approach further. IFAD 2.0 is being developed. It has been discussed by the EMC and will be presented to the board retreat in May, and very likely will form the basis for our narrative and vision for the IFAD 12 replenishment. So without further ado, let me give the floor to Paul, who will make a presentation.
As Stefania was saying, we're trying to plan ahead for the future, and particularly IFAD 12 will be coming next year. And one of the issues we had this last time is the president arrived April 1st, and we'd already started the replenishment. So for those of us, which was a lot of us, working on IFAD 11, it was a great challenge. The president arrives, starts to try to put forward a vision, and we're frantically trying to put together papers that we will present to the replenishment committee. And it was difficult to get much interaction around that because of the fact that we had to do it so quickly. So now we're planning way ahead. IFAD 12 is not till next year. And so we can start thinking about things right now. So what are we doing? What are we going to think going forward? The first thing we should not forget is that IFAD's mission needs to stay the same. Now, most of us believe this and are committed to that mission. But also our board has made it very clear that they do not want mission creep. They don't want a change in our mission, to us to drift away from what we're doing. That being said, we still need to make changes, and we still need to do things differently. Now to start, why do we need to do this? And this is the numbers from the last SOFI, the next one's coming out. And starting in 2014, we start seeing this increase in people that are food insecure. In 2015, we see a percent starting to go up. So food insecurity is increasing. Why is it increasing? Partly because of climate, partly because of conflict, and partly because of some economic slowdowns. So we saw this progress, and we're not making it anymore. So we need to think about what we can do about this. Are we fit for purpose to address this? So how are we going to go about doing that? And there's three areas that we want to think in terms of the work. The first is with governments. We work with governments. They're key to making sure that we achieve objectives related to food insecurity, that their policies, investments, or capacity are there, that governments, as they develop, get the right type of support. As we know, as countries transform, as the rural economies transform, the rural areas change. Agriculture becomes a driver of growth rather than a direct employer. When that happens, you expect things like infrastructure to become more important, that it's no longer supporting just productivity rises, but you have to support the value chain. And so we have to shift the types of things we're providing. And we have to be engaged in the long term. We have to be systematic and address long-term changes. So governments, of course, are one component. But we also have to keep in mind that our ultimate objective is rural people and working with them through civil society. That we need to make sure that they're included and become less vulnerable, and that we address specific constraints. And we know a lot of those constraints. Constraints to access to land, access to credit, to inputs, all sorts of things that even as we develop are consistently, the poor find themselves in these situations where they can't meet constraints, and that doesn't allow them to meet, to address food security. And then the last part is the private sector. Rural and small and medium enterprises and firms, we want to use them so people can be productive and connective. We want to see their constraints. How do we build up a private sector that helps support smallholder, poor producers get ahead? And how do we address that missing middle? We know that there's finance out there for larger scale investments. We know there's financing out there for micro investments, but there's not enough in there in between. So these are the three areas we want to support to make sure that we get sustainable, inclusive rural transformation and address food insecurity. So IFAD 2.0 is trying to bring this all together. And a lot of these things we've done. So why are we at 2.0? Now there's two reasons. One is it's trying to consolidate all of those things. All of these things that we've done across the board. The second is, quite frankly, in order to market something to our board and to others, we have to show that we're doing something different. And so a lot of people say, well, we're doing a lot of these things. And that's true. But what we're trying to do is consolidate. So we had IFAD 1.1, 1.2, 1.3. We've reached this point, now we're shifting. So it's 2.0. What is that made up of? Shifting. The first is our program of loans and grants. Oh, sorry. Before I got that, so the idea is a lot of what we've done is focused around a project-based model. Now we've moved away from that over time. We have more policy engagement, more policy dialogue. We do other things other than projects, but still the fundamental nature has largely been around projects. And we want to shift that to being more comprehensive, doing more things, working with the private sector.
No?
I'm just loud, so it seems like it is. Is it? Okay. Now you're really going to be unhappy I have a real mic. So a comprehensive financial policy-oriented and programmatic package. And that works with those elements, the government, civil society, and the private sector. And the key is to try to do that in a synergistic manner, to make those pieces work together. And so part of the issue that we see out there is people are working in all these areas, but they're not working at the same time in all of these areas. So how do we get it so that so it's all working at the same time? So we're starting with the program of loans of grants. So the idea is over the next 11, 12 years to double the PLG by IFAD 14, so by 2030. With tailored products for rural transformation, as I said, as countries change, they need different types of products, and a new financial architecture. In order to do this, we have to have a different financial architecture. The tailored approach, flexible, differentiated projects for rural transformation, as I mentioned, and 2 allocation windows. One based on our PLG that we already do, and another based on a risk allocation framework. So obviously, this, of course, is closely linked to the financial architecture. So a financial architecture that leverages debt funding from outside. So we've already started doing this. We have sovereign loans. We borrow from KfW, from the Spanish. We have concessional partner loans from India, France, I believe, and I think we're getting with Finland. That's one form of debt financing. Another form, though, of course, is to go to the market. So if we go to the market, we can borrow off of our asset base, and we're able to get more funding that way. So even without core replenishment, we expect it to go up, but not a lot. The situation out there is such that even assumptions of a 3% increase, sometimes our board members will question that. So how do we expand and get to doubling? It's by leveraging. Now, doing that, we also need to make sure that we're keeping up with what countries want. And so we have to have differentiated financial products, different terms and conditions of products, different types of projects, and all of those things to make sure that we are meeting the needs of the countries. We also need to deal with our debt sustainability framework. So the debt sustainability framework, we're basically digging ourselves in a hole. We provide loans to governments that are supposed to be paid back by our donors. So we count them as loans as if we're going to get a reflow. And so the United States, Germany, the Netherlands promised to pay us that back into the future. Now they're not coming through and doing that. So we give money that's basically a grant, but we don't get the reflow. The more that happens, the bigger the hole we dig. When we shifted the PLG for IFAD 11, we expanded the amount of funding that we could give to poorer countries, rightfully so. We should be focusing on them. But what's happening is it's making us dig a bigger hole. And so what we have to do is deal with this, and Alvaro and his team have come up with proposals to do that, to limit the amount that we put in that, and to get countries to pay up front. So if you say we'd like 10% of our funding to go to the debt sustainability framework, you have to show us the money now, not later. So it's all part of a plan to strengthen the underlying finance so we can double our PLG. So going back to that two allocation window, one would be under the PLG and the other would be under risk framework. What that means is the risk allocation framework would be for a window that's on ordinary terms. So countries that are LICs and LMICs that right now get concession or blended finance, in theory could go and borrow more money on ordinary terms. So they could, Ethiopia could borrow $100 million and then on blend terms, for example, and then borrow another $100 million in ordinary terms. Now this raises questions of can they do it? Can they absorb that money? It raises questions, do they want to have that kind of money? It raises questions about what kind of projects do they want to do that? Do they want more infrastructure projects? And this is one of the things that we hear. And we're having someone at the Center for Global Development check to see if that's true. As the terms change, are people more likely to invest in infrastructure? So the PLG is going to be obviously a key component of what we're doing. But we have two new mechanisms that we're working with. The first is tentatively called the Impact Fund for Food Security, which is about the fourth title we've come up with. The idea of this is to have something like Gavi or the Global Fund. So Gavi is the fund for vaccination. What does it do? It has a clear objective, vaccines. It targets that objective and tries to get results in that area. So it's trying to increase the number of vaccinated people. It has clear packages that it uses to go forward. So what we want to try to do is the same thing for agriculture. So we have organizations like BRAC, who was here last week. They have a model that shows results, targeting the ultra-poor. They have a package that they can use. Can we use that type of thing and scale it up to a level, at a broader level, in the same way that Gavi does these things? Can we target for results and get quicker wins to do that? So there's a whole series of these types of activities that are done by NGOs. There's BRAC, there's One Acre Fund, Heifer International, Oxfam, all of those that do all of these types of things. Now the criticism of those things is they don't bring systematic change. That you get a shorter term result, but it doesn't build to a broader change. And this is actually the woman from BRAC told us this, that this is what they're concerned about. And so when we told her this idea, they said, fantastic, we can work together. So these are interventions with proven impacts that will complement the PLG and even potentially a private sector window. In addition to doing these kind of packages of interventions, we'll have a different implementation model. Funds can come from the outside as well as from our traditional donors, meaning we could get money from foundations, from the private sector. We could also potentially have a steering committee that includes those entities. Now you can see the obvious appeal. If a foundation wants to put a lot of money in, they want a say over how the money is used. And also the implementation could be through those NGOs. Rather than working with governments, we would work directly with the NGOs to implement. So for example, you could see a project that is going and trying to improve livestock production. And what you want to do to start that project out is give some sort of asset transfer and basic training. So rather than having the government do that, you have an organization like Heifer International do it. They go in and do the basic initiation. That's not enough though. How are you going to get the systematic change? How are you going to get support ongoing? How are you going to get the market access? That's through your government program. So when we talked about this at the Eminent Group meeting, someone said you could turbocharge your projects. And this is a means to try to do that. So the impact fund. And then the third element of this is the private sector window. Now we've talked a lot about the private sector here, and the idea is to crowd in private investment and to work particularly with rural SMEs, focusing on women and youth. There's a strategy that's being done right now that will go to the board in September. We are looking for all sorts of means by which using the private sector, de-risking tools, specialized technical assistance, tailored funding, looking for that missing middle, that in-between part. And again, an implementation model that'll potentially bring funds from the outside and potentially a steering committee that helps decide where that will go. So this is the combination of things. So you can see if you're a country director in a particular country And you have to address food security. There's an issue in your country. It has climatic effects or conflict. You now have these multiple tools to try to do something about it. You work with the government on some broader programs. Then you know within that program there's things that I could do, that I could help increase, turbocharge the results in the shorter run. So you go to the impact fund and you see if you can get $25 million to target the same beneficiaries in your program to get them short-term results. And then you use that. You also see opportunities for the private sector. It's a value chain project, and there's a private sector possibilities there. So you could see about working with the private sector window to see what types of funding might come in. And so it's a broader programmatic approach than what we are able to do right now, to combine all those things, to ultimately address a concern which is growing in food insecurity and the underlying causes of that, climate, conflict, and economic slowdown. Then we hope that that will allow us to deliver on our mandate and more than double our impacts, because it'll be not just increasing the POLG, but adding grants in the private sector window, so we should be able to more than double. And in all of this, be sure that we stick to our original mission to ending rural poverty and hunger. Thanks.
So thank you very much, Paul. I mean, indeed, it's quite an ambitious plan and a paradigm shift, as you said, to scale up results and impact. Now, let's turn to our panel. And Lisandro, we start with you. So we have heard from Paul that a big focus of IFAD 2.0 is responding to the challenges of the SOFI report. So food insecurity, climate vulnerability, and fragility. And we know that the region like WCA is particularly affected by these challenges. So how do you see this new approach working in a region like WCA, especially with the creation of this new grant window? And how do you see this working?
Thank you very much, Stefania. Very easy question, I guess. Good morning, everybody, and thanks, Paul, for the presentation. It made me think that 2 years ago, when we were working on the IFAD 11 papers, we said that the time was now, or actually then, to double our efforts to achieve the SDGs. And today, I mean, two years later only, we know that in West and Central Africa, many of the countries actually will not meet the SDGs. In fact, we know that 10 countries in the world will not meet the SDGs 1 and 2, poverty and hunger, 5 of which are in actually West and Central Africa. So clearly, continuing behaving and delivering in the way that we are delivering right now, I think is irresponsible. And we really need to embrace new instruments to do these things differently. Now, it comes to mind when I see Paul's presentation, the exercise I think that I need to do is, how would this be useful if I had it today? Because in a way, 3 years from now, because we won't be able to change that rapidly, we will be in that situation. And the first word that I think about is transformational. And I think very often we have discussed the need for transformational projects in development. And what does transformational mean? The very first thing that it means in other IFIs is that you tackle the most difficult problems or constraints that a country has. And secondly, you focus on the rest of the other constraints. This is, you tackle first land reform as opposed to organizing farmers or training farmers. Part of the transformational engagement is as well working with other stakeholders, pilot and scaling up. Now, when I think about those elements and I think about the portfolio of WCA today, for me, a very potential transformational project comes to mind, to give you a practical example. And this is the VCDP in Nigeria, the Value Change Development Project, which is a 4-piece that we have. Here we have brought a lot of partners together through a series of alliances where the farmers are actually producing for off-takers that establish quantity and quality up front, and then government, with the support of IFAD, establishes basic community infrastructure, irrigation infrastructure, market infrastructure, and also addresses some policy constraints. What we have seen is that the farmers have actually doubled the production and have increased their income 7 times. Now, when I visited there, everybody was unhappy. And everybody was telling me, we need much more. And the farmers need much more inputs and significantly more resources to do the production in a more efficient manner. And here is where I see that your impact fund, I think you call it, can be a very useful and fast disbursing and fast implementing mechanism to increase the farmers' capacity to improve productivity in this Nigeria project. Then I think about the private sector. Everybody said we need dedicated financing, particularly the middle type of enterprises. And again, here we will have a window that can accelerate that. And of course, most importantly, from my current mindset, is the doubling of the PBAS, because what I think is clearly that with a double, if you want, or a triple envelope for Nigeria, many more things can be done. When I visited the Minister of Finance, he said to me, this is a jewel, but we need 10 times more because it's a drop in the ocean in Nigeria. So a combination of all these things in a concerted manner, in my view, can bring transformational engagements, and we would move from reaching what we do right now, which is 60,000 farmers, to something closer to the 80 million farmers that Nigeria actually has. So I think the scale of what you are proposing can lead us in the right direction. Very quickly, because I think I have 2 minutes only, I think about a second T. I talk about transformational, and I think about a word that I liked a lot, and it's transition. And when you think about WCA, we have 3 countries that are among the 10 fastest growing economies in the world: Senegal, Ghana, and Cote d'Ivoire. And at the same time, you have the Gambia, that is among the 10 poorest countries in the world, and the only country in the region that has actually gotten poorer over the years. So a very diversified, despite the fact that the challenges at the end look similar, it's a very diversified group of countries. And when you think about these 3 top performers and the transition in which they are towards a higher level of income and higher human development, I think we need to take better advantage of the capacities that they have to manage better results and better operations. And this is why I got interested in your assertion, Paul, that we will be developing more and more diversified instruments to make a more efficient use of our money. Again, thinking about today, right now, we are working in Senegal on a results-based lending operation that is going to diversify or help government implement all the legal framework for a better and more efficient groundnut market. And we are collaborating with the World Bank, who is putting 250 million in a project in which we are putting 15 million. So again, if we want to be serious about this type of approaches, that instead of financing inputs, finance results and take advantage of countries' development, we need a higher POLG with diversified instruments that target more policy and reforms than only the inputs and the activities that we target. Very clearly, there is a huge variety of other instruments that we can talk about, but I welcome very much this initiative. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lisandro, for having given us an idea of how the approach could work on the ground. And I think you mentioned a key word, which is transition, which transition as well to the next question, to Rosanna. So, Rosanna, another key message of IFAD 2.0 is the need to differentiate better our offering of instruments and also projects to better meet the evolving needs of our borrowing member states, including middle-income countries. Do you think that this approach is aligned with the priorities of MICT? And which are the products that you think are the most effective in this context?
Thank you for the invitation to comment on IFAD 2.0. Actually, these 2 questions I have made myself when I joined IFAD. I would like to start with describing a couple of facts on the LAC region. The first one is related to mix. We have mixed countries that have different engines of growth. However, they are facing 2 challenges that are common to them. The first one is poverty. These countries have been growing for the last decade or so, some of them for the last 2 decades. However, poverty has started to stagnate, or in some countries, the trend has been reversed. We just heard a couple of weeks ago when the statistics came out for Argentina. Now, each of 3 Argentinians is poor, 33% poverty rate in Argentina. So these countries are still facing poverty challenges, with rural poverty having the highest incidence. And the second common challenge that the MIC countries face is the climate change. And the climate change is related to poverty, in the sense that the rural poverty particularly are much more vulnerable to climate change. They don't count with the assets to protect themselves from shocks from climate change. So these are two facts that they play very much in the sense that are aligned with the IFAD mission, being IFAD 1.0, IFAD 2.0. Now, in terms of how I see this align with the needs and the strategies in the countries, first, moving towards a programmatic approach in terms of the way we work with these countries, moving away from projects. Lisandro already spoke about the complementarities. So I think that interventions isolated are not going to take us very far. So we have to start thinking about a more comprehensive approach and having programs with our countries, because here I just mentioned before to Paul, I had some difficulty with the definition, because for me programmatic is more of a sequencing of policy. No? You have policies that you implement in 1 year, you implement the second year. So for me, that's programmatic. I think we are more, this is in the public policy jargon or language, programmatic is related to that. What we are thinking now, it's more for me, and I think for our client countries, a program approach. So I think this is something that MIC countries will welcome very much. And I think this is the way to go. The private sector window, it's something that is very appealing for MIC countries. You know, the MIC countries have already been implemented. This is sort of a public-private partnership. They have been already implementing PPPs, mostly in infrastructure, but a couple of countries like Chile and Colombia are already doing PPPs for social policies. So this is something that it's very appealing, and I think that we should be starting getting ready for PPPs in social policies or for rural transformation. Well, then the challenges for me. The challenges, first is the transition until we have this all set. What should we be doing? And we talk a lot about policy engagement or policy dialogue. I think that we already do policy engagement. If we are doing a loan, if we are doing a project, we are doing policy engagement. So it's adding to that policy engagement, which the instrument is a financial part. We need to start working through policy dialogue, preparing the grounds for these PPPs, having conversation with our counterparts about their appetite for having this PPP window. We have, in the meantime, also some other instruments that we can start working on, which are the South-South technical cooperation, the reimbursable technical assistance, but more so the results-based lending, because the size of our loans for MIC countries is very small. And in fact, I give you an example. We are starting to prepare a COSOP, and we have a resource envelope of $38 million. You cannot do more than one loan with more than one project. So what do we do? So if we design a project that has results-based lending, the possibility of scaling up that kind of intervention is very high. So the other side of the table will be very much interested. Because if you only talk about the amount, they say, well, with 38 million, I am not going to move anything. I'm not going to transform anything. But if you start talking about results-based lending, they say, okay, this is to me like a pilot. If this works, and I'm sure that in your design, you are going to be very careful because you want to disperse and you need quick gains. So it's like it's a virtuous circle, no, the design. So I think that for us, the challenges are that we need to wait, but we have some opportunities. Decentralization is the first one, and second, that we have already some instruments that we can start implementing. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rosanna, for having given us also an idea of the types of instruments that you think are most effective in mixed countries. And now to Raya. So we hear all the time about the untapped potential of the private sector to make a stronger contribution to the SDGs. And IFAD 2.0 proposes the creation of a private sector window. So what is different with this new approach? And how does this dovetail with the private sector strategy that will be presented to the board in September?
Thank you very much. Good morning, dear colleagues. Does it work? Yes, okay. So the private sector, Paul said something very important during his presentation. We are launching this private sector window to strengthen our impact and keep serving our core target, which are the small-scale farmers and rural SMEs. So that's the departing point. Why are we bothering? Because, to be very frank, it's becoming very, very hard to raise money from donors, from the supply side. They have their own challenges, and usually when it comes, it's also associated with a very list of requirements. And we're also not the only ones raising money. There's a competition out there, including from our sister UN agencies. So we are looking at the private sector as a partner to raise funding, to tap into also technology, know-how of the private sector. Because we think there is a business case. We know that small-scale farmers produce 70% of the food. So this is necessary as an input for the value chain, the agribusiness companies, for the supermarket, for hotels, et cetera, And these small-scale farmers are also consumers of goods and services that the private sector wants. So there is a business case for them to work together. But it's not happening because of the different challenge that we all know very well. So IFAD approach or vision is to help address some of the challenges, to link the small-scale farmers to private sector companies and to be able to raise the funding. So the idea is, of course, to raise money from the private sector for us as IFAD to do business, but more importantly, or equally important, is for us to make this small catalytic investment that would make a much larger production facility happen or a line of credit. So we want to be catalytic to bring more funding into agriculture. And the approach will entail 3 important changes for us as an institution. The first one is the counterpart. For the past 40 years, IFAD was mainly working through governments. Through this new private sector window, the approach is to work directly with the private sector. And the project will be executed by private sector companies, no longer the project management units that we are used to. The second one linked to this is that because of this change in the counterpart, we should have more flexibility in what we want to do. Of course, the government will remain a very important counterpart. Our starting point should be the POLG, should be the government, the discussion and the policy dialogue with the government, but we should be able to do more creative things, more innovative things, so that we can also diversify the type of instruments we offer. So hopefully you'll be able to use some exotic words like mezzanine finance, blended finance, and we're hoping that this transaction could have a more catalytic effect. So just to illustrate, you all know the ABC fund, and you heard about it. Do you know how much IFAD put in the ABC fund? If I exclude, technically we put 3.5 million in a grant. We raised so far $60 million. So you can look at the type of leverage that we could achieve. And that's the ambition, is that we can double or even triple the money we can raise. So that's the second difference in the approach. The third one is because the private sector is profit-making by nature. So one will not be working with everybody. We'll look at private sector partners who share our values, who are willing actually to do good, but also do well. And that also will imply changes in the way we look at this transaction, because our board is also very cautious about using our resources for a profit-making entity. So we need one to price it according to risk. So risk would be a very important component in the way we will structure this transaction. We will have to justify our value added. Why are we supporting a private sector company? This is the concept of additionality. These are things that we need to embed into our review process to make sure that we present credible cases. But at the end of the day, we should remember that the idea is to do more for the small-scale farmers, to work with this private sector partner who share our value to be able to help the country that we can still make it to the SDGs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Turaya. There are quite some exciting opportunities to step up our engagement with the private sector. And now, last question to Katie. So IFAD 2.0 foresees the establishment of new windows. How do you see us implementing that?
Thank you. And thanks to everyone. I'm very excited to be here and also to look forward to your questions and the discussion. I would look at 2 things. One, in terms of the establishment, is the legal basis. And then the second thing is looking forward, how might we see putting together windows with mixed funding sources and potentially a broader steering committee. So starting with the legal basis, this is something that, as Paul said in his introduction, is not completely new. I mean, we have multi-donor trust funds already. If you look back to the IFAD 11 resolution, in fact, the board has told us that they want us to take all necessary measures to bring together catalytic investment alongside our POLG to further support the rural poor. So these are things that definitely have roots in IFAD's history, things we've been doing, but we're bringing them together in a more holistic way, I would say, to really have a synergistic effect, as Paul mentioned, turbocharge the effect we have on the ground. So the legal basis is there, and this is something we can build on with, for example, IFAD 12. In terms of how this might work with Windows, it's something that we are brainstorming, we'll be discussing with the board at the retreat in early May. One can think of a holistic grant window as well as a holistic private sector window, which may be structured in quite similar ways, similar to multi-donor trust funds. They could bring together, for example, resources from member states who are very focused on, for example, the grant and/or the private sector part, as well as potentially funding from foundations. You could imagine entities like Mars or Gates being very interested in one or both of these windows. And you can have that type of funding pooled together, potentially also from private sector entities themselves, some of whom may be off-takers of various projects, et cetera. And have that funding in maybe an innovative way through what Thoraya was talking about in the private sector window. The grant window would be, as Paul was talking about, used mainly for targeted investment mechanisms. And so I'd like to just close with a potential example of something, because I find, when I was first talking and thinking about this, it was a bit amorphous, and it helped to have an actual, thought of how this might look in practice. And I think one could be, I went last year, I was to Sri Lanka and was at a 4P project there on dairy with milk. And it was interesting talking to some of the farmers there. They said, look, we've really built up with IFAD's help. IFAD has done so much. The government and the company and entrepreneurs were really appreciative. But they said, we're at this point now where we're big enough, but we're not able to get, for example, a loan from a commercial local bank because the rates are too high. We don't have credit history. We don't have a bankable business plan or balance sheet. So they're exactly the people in this missing middle that we talk about. If we were to apply this three-window approach to this company, we could continue what we're already doing in our really strong POLG in helping transfer knowledge, skills, and grants to this milk producer. At the same time, we could potentially use the grant window to have a much broader impact, not just on these handful of producers, but much broader across the country, because you could deliver targeted investment mechanism like livestock, like milking machinery, like refrigeration units, like training, vaccination, how to get as much efficiency out of the milk production. These types of things could come from the grant window. Alongside that, you could use the private sector window to really scale up and help these farmers who are at the missing middle have potentially shorter term loans that would help them at a lower interest rate, but develop a credit history. So eventually they could bridge to normal commercial lending. And this is what I see as really sustainable and something that IFAD could have a long-lasting impact, because once you've helped small-scale farmers really cross that gap, that ravine of the missing middle that is so hard to cross, they come out on the other side with a truly sustainable project. The private sector can have long-term offtake agreements with them, and I think that's something very exciting, that we could really support our poor small-scale farmers in a way that is very sustainable. And so that's what I see as a real excitement about this holistic and very synergistic approach that Paul presented.
Thank you very much, Katie. I think you helped a lot to giving us even more clarity about how the approach could work. So now let us take some questions from the audience. We can start from the ICOs, if you have any questions. No one has questions? Maybe we give you some time to prepare for the question, and we see if anyone has questions from the audience. Exactly, Philippe.
Hi, good morning. Trying to break the ice. Thanks for sharing the vision for IFAD 12 and quite interesting package of thoughts and interventions. And I think, as you said, Paul, it's not all completely new. Some of that, the 4 Ps and things have been around, but repackaging and rethinking it at a bigger scale helps, and helps people like me in the operations department to think what is coming. So I was, as all of you were talking, I was thinking already about the implementation side of things and how we would probably work about that. And I was interested if there's already thinking, and I would, actually offer myself also to be engaging on these discussions if they come up. But so the NGO channel, for example, issues we have at project level is often around issues of procurement. So you end up with a government procurement system which comes up with an NGO you might not want to work with because they're the cheapest. So are we looking into these issues, and could we get maybe corporate level procurement of good NGOs that help us with that, like BRACs, no? Which are great, but we don't have them usually in our countries necessarily. Then I think we have a number of grants ongoing at the moment, strengthening capacities. No, I just have the Avanti in Lesotho happening, and this is great because it will help to focus on results. But our governments, even so many of them are now middle income, might not completely have the capacity to run through these projects as quickly as we want. So I think performance-based, I find it really interesting. I have a concern about our rigor in measuring and monitoring performance. So this question of how good we are. I mean, the baselines we have in our projects are usually questionable. And then that also would need for us to be very selective in terms of interventions, while we are at the same time going for bigger projects, which tend to be more complex. So I guess my take would be to be performance based on some subcomponents, but still have a bigger operation. But I want to hear your areas on that. Okay, I stop here. Some reactions.
This was already 3 questions in one. So.
I had more, but I stopped.
Yeah. Chitra first. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Thank you again for this presentation, and I also highly welcome the 2017 ARI asked for a paradigm shift, and you've delivered a paradigm shift and even used that language. So it's very impressive. It sounds like we're strongly moving away a bit from government as our main interlocutor in terms of funding, as well as in terms of delivery. Not moving away or adding, perhaps, is the other thing. So one thing that I had 2 questions sort of on that front. One is in terms of the private sector window, does this mean that there will be board representation by the private sector? Because in the past, when we tried to get the Gates Foundation to provide funding for IFAD, they refused because they couldn't have a seat on the board. So how does that change our board structure at all? And then on the delivery front, I do have some questions about the whole, Paris Declaration and moving through governments, and how will you address any questions that arise along those lines? And then thirdly, I mean, it does sound like we're sort of turning the IFAD model inside out. We do work with NGOs through our programs. We do work with the private sector through our loan programs. So then the question is, now you're taking it outside and creating additional financing mechanisms in addition to our loans. But how do you link them? That's always been an issue, even with our grants. So this will be even more so because it's somewhat outside. So how do you link them is my question. Thank you.
Very good. And another question, or we want to address maybe these ones first? Okay, yeah, Paul, a little bit on the implementation side and
so on the first questions, on procurements and those types of things, I would say I don't have the answer to that question. These are the things we have to think about, and we're already starting to think about with Nicole, who's sitting right behind you. We're already talking to some foundations about how they fund things and how they fund NGOs. With BRAC last week, we had a discussion about how they get their funding, how is it procured, how they work with governments, et cetera. And in fact, with BRAC, we're thinking of organizing a workshop with some of the big NGOs to discuss some of these issues of how they actually implement this. Now, my initial thoughts is that you wouldn't go through governments, that it would be procured directly, and that's a possible way to go. But that's something that we have to think about. But I'm hoping we get this kind of question from the board, because this is a question of how you do it, not whether you should do it. And so it implies that you're on board with the possibility of doing it. You mentioned also the grants. We have a separate grants mechanism, and that will stay. So that grant mechanism is still there for doing these kind of capacity type thing. We have talked about whether we would embed anything. For example, one of the issues that comes up with NGOs is we would like to work with local NGOs, but a lot of local NGOs don't have the capacity to do these types of things. And my understanding from Margarita, I don't know if she's here, is that some of the in ASAP, they wanted to work with local NGOs, but they didn't have capacity and they didn't have a means by which to bring up that capacity. So we'd have to think about whether that's something we would want to do. I'm going to leave the policy-based loan to Rosanna. And on the last the comments on the government, the idea is that the COSAP would still be the foundation for doing everything. So you're still working with governments and a broad civil society, private sector, but as a dialogue. And as part of that dialogue, you're deciding where are the areas we want to work. And if the primary hope is that you're getting synergies between these different areas, so you're working together, you have to work with governments. It's to complement what you're already doing. One of the problems we have now is we have all these actors doing these different things. This is happening. Right? You have different groups doing different things within countries. They're just not doing them simultaneously in a lot of cases. And yes, we do some of these things working with NGOs and the private sector in our projects, but it is quite limiting. And again, I talked to BRAC about this last week, and they have, I think, 2 cases where they've been able to work with us through the public sector. But they find it very challenging, and it's harder to design projects. So this allows us to do it separately. For the other questions, I think Rosanna and then Katie.
Yes, regarding performance-based lending, I fully agree with you. It is not, the PBL is not for every country, it's not for every project. You can have both models. You can have a project that's purely performance-based lending, or like we have in Cuba, we have a component that is performance-based lending. There are risks, of course, because you need to make sure you have the appropriate baselines. There's always going to be asymmetric information. You have to reduce that asymmetric information. That puts a lot more responsibility and work in terms of the staff that's designing the project. So as I said, it's something that it's working for some countries. Some countries are using what they call payment for success. But they don't use it for 25 activities. They choose 1, 2, or 3, because it's impossible for you to have, the perfect information. We will always face this, the asymmetric information. And for that, we need to have very strong technical teams that can challenge those baselines, because you can easily be fooled with a baseline that is not true and then reach that target or that trigger very easily. So it is a challenge. It's not easy, but I don't see why we should shy away from it if it's working for some countries.
Thank you very much. Katie, on the board representation question.
Yes, thanks for the good question. At this point, we're not looking to amend the board representation, which of course is by our shareholders, our owners, who are the member states. Instead, what we're thinking about is a mechanism similar to that used by other targeted investment mechanisms like Gavi and Global Fund, which is the concept of having a steering committee. And the steering committee would look at the oversight as well as implementation and review of projects and programs that would be funded using the grant window and or the private sector window, again, targeted in a holistic way to scale up or add to what we're already doing with the POLG via the COSAP approach. In the seats on that steering committee in other organizations have been done by those who have contributed to the relevant window. So the concept is that that could be a mixed seats, for example, of member states, potentially foundations, or other entities which also contribute to each window.
Very good. I think the President wants to say a few words first.
Thank you. Very quickly, I just wanted to come back on some of the points raised. At the outset, let me say that the question raised, I see that as a good rehearsal for the retreat because they are quite very sharp and quite strong point that we need to deepen the reflection. On the NGO perspective, I'm not worried at all. Obviously, what I don't feel that Paul had the time to get to that level of granularity during his presentation. Obviously, one question that you might ask was the implication of all of that in our daily management, which is we will have to deal with from HR to IT, et cetera, et cetera. And one of it, you will just need to set up the parameters on how you select the due diligence that you need to do to select the NGOs. Others have done it so much that, and it does not mean, and I want to link that, it's a traditional thing. There will be some national or local NGO or some international NGO where the due diligence will come up like, do not do business with them. And there will be others, local or international, that you want to focus on. And you want to make sure that those that you selected are okay with the government is, et cetera, et cetera. So that will have to be done, but I'm not foreseeing a big kind of headache on that. However, that links directly to Chitra's question on the government. I think it's very, very, very important to keep in mind that the government remains at the central of all we're doing. I'm comparing that to, sometime in a university or you have your program, going through a program. It does happen that the school can call on a professor outside the university for something very specific. It doesn't mean that you are not anymore under that university or under that program on that. So that's why, when Paul was making a presentation, I was thinking that the POLG should have a stronger color or a better volume to reflect the fact that the government remain on that. What we're talking about, once we identify those packages, particularly if we take, for example, the SOFI report, or you come to a country that you really know that because of fragility, man-made or not, the national institutions have been weakened. And therefore, you want to have a surgical intervention to lift up the food security dimension. It does not take away that your global POL is still dealing with the policy dialogue that Rosanna was talking about, and the ongoing thing that we're doing through the course of the performance-based, and the questions are how good are we in terms of that. Again, I think Paul didn't have the time to make those presentations. We expect that to be one of the big topics during the retreat, is how do we lift up our whole impact assessment and all of that. That will be one of our bets, and I hope the bet is not just a bet. One of our bets is that the more we will be able to have, already IFAD is quite lucky because we are focused and therefore easier to do our performance, everything being equal, easier to do our performance, our impact assessment. But by going in a more kind of narrow intervention, we do believe that it will make it even much more evident to make the link between the resource that we mobilize, how we use them, and the results we are getting. But again, however, contrary to the NGO, this one, intentionally, we know what we got to do, but I will say that it's not automatic. It's not automatic pilot. You need to dig into the how on The issue about the governance, just to complement what Katie was explaining, very likely the direction we want to take, one, I don't feel that we're going to propose, I just want to be clear on that, we're not going to propose any change of the existing EB structure for this. We may have other changes that Donald is spearheading on that ongoing changes, which we'll look at. But in other words, we're not going to say that we're going to have non-member state being part of EB on that. If that proposal to be on the table, you'll have to come from the member state, not from IFAD. I want to be clear on this. However, what we're going to do, whether we call it a board, whether we call it a council or a steering committee, if we take the private sector window, if we take that grand window, is to have that steering committee where member states and the non-member state actors that are putting money, you need to define what's the threshold, but that are putting money can sit and having much more direct say on the project, on the resource allocation and the resource utilization. That, of course, we are drawing lesson from those vertical forms that has been going on that. So that is going to be important to make the distinction between our big existing governance, which itself had to be uplifted for other reasons, and for that specific windows, we're going to have a specific steering committee or alike. And talking about the windows, pragmatism also need to come to play. This is really where the rubber hits the road. Some member states may prefer to just have one pledge, be it this for whatever pledge this is for DSF, and this is private sector, or this is etc. Others may want to have different things. So we are not excluding the way it's set up, like very likely somehow that members will be at ease to make only one big thing and give us maybe the direction of how to do the allocation from internally. Then no, I think, that's about it, yeah.
Okay. Thank you so much, Mr. President. Yeah, we're running a little bit late, but we can do another last round of questions. Please keep it short. Yeah, Bernadette. And then I see Rania, yeah.
Okay, thank you, Stefania.
Bernadette,
I just had one question. It is really to try and understand how the institution is thinking about the aid for trade agenda. Because I think if we look at our traditional donors, they are moving more towards the aid for trade, where they are able to finance specific investments which will unlock the supply chains for the flow of particularly agriculture products from perhaps Africa to Europe. So the question is, their interest is to unlock those supply chains. Our interest is to uplift the farmers, right, to be able to contribute towards that agriculture trade agenda. So the question is, how do we see this within the scope of this IFAD 2.0? Because it could really be complementary if IFAD had some sort of a strategy looking at how the interventions at the national level will contribute to this regional food trade agenda. So it's a complementary thing to those three windows. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Bernadette. We have Rania there.
Thank you.
Rania.
Paul, you started your presentation, I don't know if this is working.
No.
By saying that, we have to make sure that there's no mission drift at all and that our target group has to be the poorest. And in that context, we hear that coming up again and again by the board members and particularly by the evaluation committee. Do you feel that there might be a risk in perception by the board that there is some kind of mission drift, particularly if we start targeting the missing middle, which they don't necessarily perceive as our primary target group? And do you think that there will be any provisions in our updated targeting approach for this, or would there be a separate targeting approach for the private sector window and for some of the other mechanisms that we may use?
Okay. Yes,
Yeah,
last
thank you.
one.
Thank you, Stefania. First, would like really to say that we are delighted to see that IFAD through 2.0 is diversifying the tools with which we engage with the government at the front line. This will bring innovation, and it will help us as country directors to also improve the quality of the portfolio. I have a point regarding youth employment in particular. In most, if not all, our member states, priority number one today is youth employment. When you discuss with the Minister of Finance a loan, his first question is, what's the rate? The second question is, how many jobs you are creating with this loan? So I think it's really a top priority. And when you look at what we are proposing, I think it's there under the private sector, the SMEs window. It's hidden somehow in there. And if you look at the agribusiness industry at a global scale, I think it's like a 5 trillion business that generates 40% of the jobs. So the ABC fund, for example, would be a good linkage between smallholders and creating jobs for rural youth. My question or my worry there is that if we are targeting the missing middle through that window, are we sure that we will capture the rural youth in there? Should we create maybe something like an impact fund for rural youth employment, similar to the one on food security? How can we make sure that we are inclusive when we do that? I mean, when we use things like the ABC fund for rural youth employment. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maybe very quickly, Natalia, and then we, yeah.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question, and hopefully it's not preempting anything. We've talked about the second window, which maybe potentially will be funded by market borrowing or any kind of borrowing to scale up, to give additional financing to countries that currently are on highly concessional terms. My question is, how much leeway do you think there is for specific IFAD pricing? So, you know, higher, maybe higher than the World Bank's. How much elasticity is there in that sense compared to, for instance, allocation? Thank you.
Thank
Thanks.
you very much. Yeah, Donald is the last one.
Yeah, I just thought, because I know there's a lot of questions on this governance and the funds. The best example I know, I'm like Paul, you can normally hear me if my mic doesn't work. So the best example I know, which is most applicable here, is there's something called the Global Partnership, the Global Polio Eradication Initiative, GPEI. It sits in WHO. WHO is a member state organization. The governance does not change at all. I think it's worth probably about 7 or 8 billion overall. It's probably the most successful, I really like the President's words, surgical intervention we probably had in terms of we're almost at the point of eradicating polio, which is only the second disease we'll ever have eradicated. But it's a very specific one. It has a steering committee, but it doesn't make any changes to the overall governance of WHO, but it's very specific. And everyone in WHO, if you ask any member state, they love it because it's very specific. It does what it says. It's eradicating polio, but it doesn't affect the governance. And I think that's exactly what we're thinking of.
Thank you very much, Donald. So maybe we can start with some questions for Thuraya on the Aid for Trade agenda, but also on the youth employment window.
Thank you very much. Indeed, I didn't know the audience would be that tough, actually. So my immediate reaction to your question is to say for food to be traded, it needs to be produced first, and it needs to meet the necessary quantity and quality standards. And that's at the heart of what we do at IFAD. So already contributing to the agenda. Then through the private sector strategy or window, the intention is exactly to contribute to this trade or to facilitate trade by one, developing the necessary links between the markets and the farmers. So, for example, supporting production facilities, and actually, one of in the private sector strategy there are now 2 pillars. One is about scaling up investment into agriculture including into necessary facilities to be able to transform the produce and link it to markets. And the second one is about creating market and income opportunities by partnering with either technology companies or agribusiness companies. So yes, we are definitely contributing. We're helping that the private sector will provide a more I'd say natural or clear link, but in my view, everything we do is contributing to this agenda. That's my answer. Now, the question raised by Naufal about youth employment. We need to remember that to solve youth unemployment, you have two options. Either you work on self-employment, which means that you help these young people create their own businesses, grow, and create jobs for themselves and for others, or you help existing businesses grow so that they can need more people and they would hire. Having worked on entrepreneurship for a while, the first route is the most difficult because, and the huge mistake that a government could make, and it's happened in North Africa especially, that they want to create entrepreneurs out of people who have no entrepreneur skills. And that's, for me, is a loss of resources, of these very few resources. So through the private sector window, through the ABC fund, the idea is to help brownfield companies grow so that they can create more jobs, but also work maybe on few impact funds that would develop either technology or also income opportunity for a large number of youth. But the more important message I would like to convey that we need to work on two fronts. We cannot, I mean, it will be, how to say, unrealistic to think that we will end up with every single African young person creating the next Facebook. So we need to work on these existing SMEs, which are the backbone of most of the economies in developing countries, to help them grow. And once these young people develop or build some expertise, they can run or create their own companies. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Paul, do you want to address the question on the mission drift?
Thanks. Just a quick comment on the youth. One possibility with the Impact Fund is if you have a broader program and you think that young people or women or indigenous people are particularly constrained in taking advantage of that, you could use those kind of targeted interventions to try to allow young people to participate. So you can use that as a targeting mechanism. The mission drift question is hard because one, it's going to be impossible to prove one way or the other for years to come and what happens. The question, though, ultimately gets to, if we say that we want to get bigger and we want to leverage, and that means we're going to borrow from the market, and then that means we have to have different kinds of loans in order to make sure they're paid back, this won't fly. We can't have our financial architecture drive the types of projects that we do. And this is ultimately the issue of mission drift. This is what our donors think. They think that we potentially are going to do different things just in order so that we can lend on ordinary terms and we can get bigger. And this is part of the point why I keep talking about rural transformation. That's not why we need to change the types of things we do. We need to change the types of things we do because countries change. They need more infrastructure. As you transform, you need storage, you need markets, actual physical markets, you need tertiary roads, you need irrigation. All of those things are more likely to be funded on higher terms because of the fact that they are needed and because they have a higher financial return. And so the key to all of this is to make that argument that we're not doing this because we want to just get bigger. We're doing it because in order to meet the concerns about food insecurity and to keep up with the transformation that's going on, we need to change the types of projects we do and the types of financing we do, and it should all be driven by that. And so that's the argument that, and I think it's the correct argument, but it's the argument we need to use because the concern is that if we think the other way around, we'll be in trouble.
Thank you very much. Soraya, you want to say something?
Yes, actually, I wanted to answer or to add to what Paul said about this mission drift. So far, we've been working through governments to serve these small-scale farmers. What we're trying to achieve here is to use different channels. The key to avoid the mission drift is that you need to structure your transaction in a way that gives assurance to your board that your funding will end up benefiting the people you are supposed to serve. So instead of going through a government, I can go through an SME or a bank, but I can put very clear eligibility criteria. You can only touch IFAD funding to provide loans to this kind of businesses that would need it and that are the core segment that I'm supposed to serve as an institution. There are ways actually of making sure that you do not have this mission drift. And second, as I mentioned in the beginning, part of the documentation that we will have to provide to the board or whoever will be approving the transaction is a justification to give them also the comfort that there is no mission drift. Thank you.
Thank you, Toraya. And now I think the President wants to say a few remarks.
Just
well, we're running out of time. So
I know you guys are running
yeah.
out of time. A question. I was expecting one question, so it didn't come out. So I'm going to ask it to myself. Where do you see as challenges in this whole thing we are presenting? What are our soft spots? You know, because for me it's going to be important that all of us understand what is the strong piece of this and what are and how we present it outside. I really want to encourage all of us to be able to be sending more or less the same message out there. We have to globally, excuse my language, sell this product in a very harmonized manner. So it's going to be important to tell you where I see sometimes I get worried, where I get excited as well. So I'll start with where is our soft spot. I want us to be. One is what you just been addressed, the mission drift. You just need to understand that doesn't matter how we presenting it. My analysis, let me say this way, so I can take on the responsibility of that. My analysis is that the more you go to the market borrowing, like the banks have been doing, be it the multilateral development bank or some bilateral development banks, they tend to only be focused on looking at projects that are bankable, projects that are profitable. Whereas our constituency, donor or borrowing member alike, they really want the D side of DFI, development finance institution we are, instead of just a financial institution. And therefore, they're getting worried that when you start going to the market and so forth, that you might be drifting your mission, getting away. So I want to back up what Paul and Toraya have said, but it's important for you to know that we are hearing this, and it's important to be able to explain. It just make me think that between now and the retreat, or even after the retreat, we may want to prepare some kind of what do I tell to my counterparts? That, few points. What are the 3-4 points? Maybe together with COM, we can do that. So the staff can also, when they are discussing that with others, those are the points, okay, no, it's not a mission drift, which is one. Secondly, it's just like, this morning I was congratulating Marco Makochi, he ran the marathon yesterday, and I was compared to myself. I'm not even able to run half of that in my entire life. So sometimes it gives the impression that why are you looking for the big marathon if you are not able to run the short distance? So for us, the short distance is solving our DSF problem. You see, right now, if we don't provide an adequate solution for the long-term DSF, it has a direct impact, let's face it, on this. So we cannot insist enough on providing the solution to I'm not talking about IFAD 11. I think we'll have a solution for 11. But moving forward, what are the long-term sustainable solution for DSF, which is the second thing that is a bit, can cause us some kind of problem. Thirdly, is there a competition, an internal competition between the program of loan window and the grant window on that? In theory, yes, somebody can just decide not to pledge the regular pledge and put the money on the grant side or vice versa. So when we cross that bridge, when we get one of the things is to do exactly what we have done for the CPL. Some of you might know that we said that before you can give me a CPL, you want to make sure that it's 80%, Leo, that you pledge at least 80% of what you pledge the last replenishment. So you can put some caveat like this to make sure that there's no substitution. Thanks so much. The substitution risk is the third point that we need to keep that. Fourthly, is this global. One of the problems that, one of the fun that Toraya and the PMI are having with the private sector strategy is the fact that globally, sometimes you have those skepticism that are not grounded. It's just a general skepticism. Is IFAD ready to do that? Is IFAD ready to do this? This type of thing, we have to expect it on that. Another reason for us that by the time, and I believe we have enough time for that, I think we of course, we don't want to precipitate things, but the more we put the reform to a point of stabilization, the better it is for us. We can't get ourselves 3 years down the road still in kind of disruptive reforms, short-term, hopefully, and while tackling the 2.0. So normally the timing is very well thought of, but implementation is another thing. Another point in terms of the worry and the soft spot that we need, I'm saying soft not because we are worried per se, but think that we need to be prepared to explain, etc. The last point that I see is, and I believe Paul touched on it, and they also implicitly, Rosanna and the question from Chitra, the whole quality issue that we get from the ARI and the and the ride of this world. We do. I don't want to get technical. The only point that because I know you have some issues there. However, what is critical, we have to be clear to be able to make the case to our member state that the quality of our delivery is not stalling, as we saw from the ride and the hurry in the last 2 years or so. That's the element that one kind of a soft that we need to prepare and be able to defend that. On the other side, obviously, I don't want to talk IFAD 12 now. This year and next year, there are so many institutions that are going through replenishment. IDA, Africa Development Bank.
GASP.
Next year, GASP. Next year, IFAD. Next year, Gavi. Name them. There's a lot of ongoing replenishment. So the more dynamic we are, the more we stand firm, the better it is. It is for us. Other strong element that I have to say is that there is a general concern that we are really lagging behind as to SDG 2.0 in general on that. Second point is, you see, this year everything is also about momentum. Not seize your momentum and be able to show that you are there and you can answer. You can be the answer. We know very well that this year there's the Secretary General called for a big summit in September on climate change. And within that, I think the Brit will be presenting a special event on the climate change. Then you have the Dutch and Bill Gates. They are spearheading this commission on adaptation. And here comes something called IFAD ASAP, which has been very well acclaimed. How do we use that to position ourselves? This becomes a comparative advantage, and is part of this ground window that Paul explained. So that momentum is something that I believe plays to our to our favor. Secondly, is also what also play in our favor, despite, at least if we can know that the struggle in terms of reform we have been going the last 18 months if there is a positive side for it, is the external is really not only our executive board members, the external actors are really following what IFAD is going through, what IFAD is doing. And generally, it's looked at if they are able to do that, that means they can also respond to those big challenges that are coming up. Fourthly, what we have also seen, which we all know, but I'm very gratified that is almost a consensus. The fact that we are lagging behind on SDG 2.3 and 2.4 specifically, which calls for doubling the productivity and the smallholder income. So we do have all those that are playing our favor. What direction is going to go? I honestly cannot tell you today. Our first acid test is going to be May 6, 8 during the retreat. After that, very likely we'll have another another interact like this one to again brief all of you and together trying to see. Meanwhile, I'm not concluding, but I really want to encourage questions or comments that you might have to send to the secretariat on this, Stefania and Constanza and Paul, to questions, and believe you me, it's very, very helpful on that. And finally, I believe you find a name for your grand widow family. Yeah. Okay, we still trying to say from a marketing viewpoint, if he's the writer, we struggle since the EMC retreat. So I believe the jury is still out there. If you have something to propose, what that catchy name that we want to use this to make clear what we're trying to achieve and be able to present it to the outsiders. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. President. We really need to conclude now. And if you have other questions, you can send an email to IFAD Talks or also post them on the internet forum with hashtag IFAD Talks. Thank you very much for having participated. It has been longer than what was expected. And thank you for our ICOs who have attended. Have a good day and a good week.